Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a Little Blue Book. It happens to be Little Blue Book number 466, and it is titled A History of Sculpture, written by Murray Sheehan. Copyright 1924. This is part 3, and we left off on page 22 in a new chapter called Rome. As has already been pointed out, the most characteristic product of Roman sculpture was undoubtedly her wealth of portraits, both in busts and in full-length figures. Rome shared in the development of later Hellenistic art, and as we have seen, one of the movements in this activity was a tendency to realism, whereas the Greeks had turned naturally to gods. The Romans turned to people, the persons of everyday life. With a great rise of Roman wealth, as she proceeded to conquer the world, Roman luxury grew by leaps and bounds, and the Romans indulged their love of ostentation by having portraits made, not only of themselves, but also of all their ancestors. Temples, marketplaces, squares, and private homes swarmed with these effigies, as do our museums today. Besides the literal thousands of reproductions which the Romans ordered to be made of the masterpieces of Greek sculpture, bronze, marble, and even semi-precious stones like foriery, etc., were used in these works, which range from the somewhat hard and formalistic portraits of the times to Augustus, through the multitude of tendency portraits of Antonius, the favorite of the Emperor Hadria, to the strongly naturalistic works of later centuries. Another rich field for Roman sculpture lay in the bas-reliefs, which with temples, columns, arches, etc., were decorated. Some of the earlier of these, from the time of Augustus, were of a chaste simplicity, largely reminiscent of the Greeks, whom Augustus greatly admired, but later they developed a daring sense of high relief, utterly unlike the classic Greek art. They are generally more crowded than the older works and stand out in such high relief that many of the figures are almost totally disengaged from the background. The Arch of Titus and the Trajan's Column at Rome show this later development, a style which has been much more used in modern times than the more restrained method of the Parthenon, frieze, or the Altar of Peace erected at Rome under Augustus. Then there were those charming bas-relief arrangements of flowers and foliage and birds and animals which so caught the fancy of Renaissance artists and have formed the stock in trade of architectural sculptures ever since. Rich garlands of fruit looped between the skulls of cattle or conventionalized eagles are the sort of thing I mean so prevalent today, and all derived directly from the Romans. The Greeks were more given to using hands of rosettes, or that decoration which architects call egg and dart. It is typical of Roman luxuriousness that this more simple type of decoration no longer satisfied, and that a heavier, more ornate style arose for their pleasure. It is all very well for us to talk of Roman sculpture being a long decadence from the Greeks, and yet when we consider the wealth of really very fine marbles and bronze discovered in Pompeii, that inferior Roman city covered over by the ashes of Vesuvius in the year 79 AD, we can but blush to think of the comparative impression one of our own cities would make 2,000 years hence if suddenly it were today in a similar manner submerged to be unearthed in the year of, say, 4000 AD. To be sure, the Romans imported vast numbers of Greek masterpieces, and had Greek artists make infinite copies of other great works, for which we can only bless them today. Since Since this way only we know some of the finest of antique statues, but they are also developed a style of their own, distinctly realistic, which has strongly influenced all subsequent work. Sorry, that was a bit of a weird sentence there. New chapter, Early Christian Sculpture. The early centuries of the Christian religion were not favorable to the development of sculpture, inasmuch as figures in the round were looked upon as too closely akin to pagan idols. But some few figures, to the Good Shepherd, for instance, and some decorated sarcophagi of wealthy early converts to the new and forbidden religion, have been preserved to us, and we can see that they differed in nothing from the other works of these late Roman times. Scenes from the Old and the New Testament were carved in low relief on the sides of sarcophagi in a somewhat crude manner. These early Christians were less afraid of decorative carvings than of complete figures, as we can see also by their eager use of painting and of mosaics at the very time when they felt it sacrilege to use fully modeled figures, either nude or draped. In the East, where Constantinople became the capital of the empire in 330 A.D., sculpture flourished to a greater extent, but very little of this work has survived to our day. Since there sprung up in the 8th and 9th centuries a powerful sect which set about the destruction of all statues as being contrary to Holy Writ. They are known as iconoclasts, from two Greek words meaning breakers of statues. Byzantine art was essentially an art of color, in all events hardly conducive to statuary. We do possess some exquisite small carvings in ivory of late Byzantine workmanship, and some very fine bits of small decorative work in gold and silver. But these, once more, like gems and coins, etc., do not concern us here. Taken all in all, the period from the 3rd to the 11th century A.D. can quite accurately be called the Dark Ages as far as sculpture is concerned in Occidental countries. It must be remembered throughout this booklet that we are not discussing Oriental art, which, although it derived largely from the same source as Western sculpture, that is to say, from Babylon and Greece, has followed a course of its own, which it is not our providence here to consider. We are attempting to follow out the course and the influences which shaped the sculpture of our own tradition in Europe and America. Thus, the rich fields of Buddhist and Oriental sculpture in general, well worth of study and admiration, will not be touched on here at all. And I think I need a drink. Next chapter. Romanesque sculpture. If the church was largely instrumental in inhibiting the development of sculpture, she made up for it handsomely in the 11th century and afterwards by encouraging such a display of statuary in churches, cathedrals, religious monuments, etc., as had perhaps never been surpassed. In the 11th century there came a great flare of religious enthusiasm, which manifested itself in feverish building, due in part to the fact that the world had not come to an end in the year 1000 A.D., as had been abundantly prophesied, and in part of the excitement of the Crusades, the people of Europe seemed to take on a new and unprecedented sense of religious unity in the 11th century. And we find churches and abbeys springing up all over Europe, and many of them were richly decorated within and without with sculpture. The structures erected from the 3rd to the 11th century had been ornate with color and bright marbles inside, but with rare exceptions had been plain even unto severity outside. This was now no longer the case, but richly carved porticos, columns, pulpits, etc., began to spring up in what we call, naming it for the architectural style which housed it, Romanesque sculpture. If we will put ourselves back into the spirit and the conditions of those good people of the 11th century, we shall be in a better position to enjoy the work of these primitive artisans, which, be it confessed, is not always beautiful in the eyes of the uninitiated. A Romanesque doorway of carved figures seems to most people a congruence of awkward shapes, utterly unlike anything in heaven or earth, distorted in proportions unnatural, more frequently ridiculous than beautiful to 12th century eyes. 20th century eyes, But we must remember that for centuries sculpture had been practically a lost art. There were present here and there superb figures from antique times, but these were looked upon as pagan images, not appropriate for the house of God, and not to be imitated in subject or in manner. The only religious art they knew was that found in the somewhat stiff mosaics due to Byzantine influence, and in miniature paintings rich with complicated designs of the Illuminists, and in minute carvings of ivory. To these they turned for their models, and these it was that they copied in their large carvings in their churches. As a matter of fact, the secret of enjoying Roman sculpture is to accept it frankly as decoration, not as realistic depiction of scenes from daily life or the portrayal of holy stories as they must have looked in reality. For that art we must go to the Gothic of the 13th century. But when once we have adopted this point of view, we shall find that Romanesque sculpture is gloriously rich, truly a feast for the eyes. So we can take roughly the date of the Norman Conquest in 1066 as an easy way to remember the time when sculpture reawoke in Europe, after its lethargy of nearly 7 centuries. Examples will be found all over Europe, in Italy, France, Spain, Germany, and everywhere sculpture was using figures of saints and angels, etc., to give a rich pattern of light and shade. They were not imitating nature, they were merely enlarging the themes and the patterns of the manuscripts and the work of earlier goldsmiths as models. Just as Romanesque architecture itself was an art which, in comparison with the later Gothic architecture, seems curiously restrained and limited, so also followed it in rapid succession. But the true lover of beauty can find much to delight his soul in this earlier work. And we'll take another drink, because cottonmouth. Let me make sure I only turned one page. Yep. New chapter, Gothic sculpture. What was it that in the 13th and 14th centuries seemed to have opened the eyes of European sculptors to the world about them, striking from their perceptions the blindfolds of convention that had blinded them in the 11th and 12th centuries? But it what it may. That doesn't make sense. But it what it may. We find now a glorious emancipation of sculpture all over Europe, with a rapid flowering of Gothic architecture, one of the brightest periods of mankind's achievements. Instead of being mere decorations, figures of the saints suddenly became living creatures. The porticos of churches are filled with a population of medieval men and women, infinite in their charming realism. The capitals of columns bloom forth with the most exquisite carvings of realistic flowers and vines and foliage. Scenes from the daily lives of the people are commingled with scenes from the Bible. All Europe has suddenly learned to carve figures, at once naturalistic and restrained, such as had not been seen on earth since the great times of the 4th and 5th centuries BC in Greece. France was the great center of this art. Pardon me. Which by an irony of fate had come to be known as Gothic. Her cathedral churches of Notre Dame at Paris, Chartres, Amiens, Reims, etc., manifested this sculpture at its finest, and proved an inspiration for sculptors in other lands. But Germany, Spain, England, and Italy all produced fine Gothic art, also worthy of long study. One of the incredible features of both Romanesque and Gothic sculpture is this very fact of its universal practice all over Europe simultaneously, at a time which most people think of as one of limited civilization and social intercourse. The very opposite is true. Of course, And at no time, perhaps, have ideas and abilities so readily flowed from one land to another, as in the medieval world of Europe. The very sculpture which we are now studying goes to exemplify truth. The leading spirit of most Gothic sculpture was a sweet humanity, free from aestheticism, not over-religious, although it was wholly a religious art. The angels have most engaging smiles, utterly devoid of sanctimonious self-righteousness. The saints are pleasant people, not far different from the market folk on Saturday. Even Christ and his mother are winning rather than stern. Indeed, there is much actual gaiety in the decoration of many Gothic structures, as in those carved devils and monstrous animals, which jut out here and there on the towers of Notre Dame at Paris, and in the gargoyles which discharge the rain from the roofs of Gothic churches, sometimes with most obscene gestures. One cannot refrain from feeling that Gothic artisans were enjoying themselves hugely when they were carving their figures. Happy workmen they, whose travail was good sport, and at the same time to the glory of God. I use the word artisans advisedly, for most of the work of both Romanesque and Gothic sculptures was by men who did not sign their statues, and thus we do not know their names. But in Italy there now began to manifest itself that spirit of individualism which bore such fruit in the Renaissance, and thus it is that we here know the names of some early sculptors, notable among whom stand Nicola Pizano, died about 1280, and his son Giovanni, about 1250 to 1328. Their masterpieces are pulpits in Pisa, Stena, and Pistoia, and a great fountain at Pergia. In these they went for guidance to antique figures of Roman sculptures, for which, I'm sorry I butchered those names, for which reason they are frequently included among the Renaissance workers. But it is interesting to note that it was the Gothic spirit of realism that sent them to the antiques. They saw that the ancients had somehow captured the secret of imitating nature, and they went to these old works to try to capture the secret from them. Thus we gain a different conception of the beginning of the Renaissance from what is usually stated. These men in all their decorative details were distinctly Gothic, and it was from the Gothic point of view that they approached the ancients. Andrea Pizano, 1273 to 1348, a pupil of Giovanni, made a set of bronze doors for the Baptistry of Florence, where all the outlines of decorations are still Gothic, just as was the case of the highly colored tabernacle in Or-San Michel, in the same city by Orcagna in 1329 to 1368, and the ornate tomb of San Sigmario in Verona of about 1374. The wealth of Gothic carvings on the Doge's Palace in Venice from the 14th century is all anonymous. Such work as today would make the fame of its creators. Toward the end of the 14th century, we find portrait sculptures once more arising, and, as in the case of the Etruscans, it was oddly enough the portrayal of the dead, for use on tombs, that led to the revival of individual likenesses. Most of these were recumbent figures lying on a slab with arms folded, in imitation of the old brass plates which had covered the tombs on the floors of churches. Crusaders who had been to Jerusalem were shown with their legs crossed as well. so that both their arms and their lower limbs made the holy sign, as they lay in the effigy of death. Later it became the custom to show the dead, kneeling as if in prayer, a feature derived from religious paintings in which the donor was thus depicted. And I think we'll end there for part 3, and we'll begin part 4 with a new chapter, The Renaissance of Siena. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in part 4.